Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the International Solidarity Pod, which is a podcast that aims to explore current affairs and history relating to imperialism, the global south, gender, political economy, and people to people ties. I'm your host, Ashwin. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. We count on your support. Today we have on Vijay Prashad. Vijay, is on the program for the second time. He's the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, and the author of over 40 books, including Poorer Nations: A Possible History of the Global South, The Darker Nations: A People's History of the Third World, and Red Star Over the Third World. In this episode, we're discussing a whole bunch of things, current affairs, essentially, including the Iran-Israel conflict, the India-Pakistan conflict, Zohran Mamdani's recent Democratic primary win in New York, and the tasks of the global left today and prospects for socialism. In addition to whichever platform you're watching or listening to this on, you can follow the work I do on Instagram at Journal of INTL Solidarity and on Substack at intlsolidarity.substack.com. If you're listening to this on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave a review as it helps get this program to new listeners. All right, here's my conversation with Vijay Prashad. Okay. All right, Vijay, thanks for being back on the program. Welcome back to the International Solidarity Pod. Okay, since we last talked, in March, a lot has happened. The genocidal war in Gaza continues and has been taking, increasingly ugly and barbaric dimensions. We'll come back to that in a bit. But what I wanted to start with was both this confrontation between India and Pakistan, two nuclear powers, after the Pahalgam attack, and also the recent direct conflict between Iran and the Israeli regime and the U.S. To put it lightly, things are moving quickly. The global situation is palpably escalating. Before we zoom into each of these conflicts, I wanted to start out by asking you, obviously, these two conflicts, they have major differences to them. What do you see as the through line between them?
Well, I think the most important through line is that both the conflicts, very different in character, because they have different origin points. The Israeli attack on Iran was utterly illegal and unprovoked. The India-Pakistan situation is much more fluid and complicated. Also, not sure about the legality of the attack, okay? But it's a much more fluid situation. What was clear, what was actually resonant through both conflicts, the three-day war between India and Pakistan, the air war, and the almost little over a week conflict between Israel and Iran. It was clear that these are all tightly matched partners. That once you get to generation 4, 4.5 weapon systems, air defense systems, drone systems, and so on, nobody can really defeat anybody. The Indians were not able to destroy Pakistan's air defense systems. That was the plan. That's why Indian aircraft didn't enter Pakistani airspace. They stayed in Indian airspace, were bombing from there. In the same way, basically, it was even Stevens between Israel and Iran. What would have changed the equation is had the United States bombed more heavily and severely. In fact, it turns out it was most likely a kind of theatrical bombing, but the United States can tilt the balance. These countries are pretty evenly matched. I mean, India and Pakistan, the war planners should sit back and say, I think this is it, guys. Let's go to the table and come up with a political agreement and draw the line, make the line of control into a border or whatever. Let's just close this down. Nobody can win a war anymore. Yeah, you've got really good weapon systems. We've got good weapon systems. We both have nuclear weapons. Let's relax. Between Israel and Iran, similarly, both have superb, missile systems. Both are able to penetrate each other's air defenses. Most likely, Iran is going to test a nuclear bomb in a few months because why wouldn't they? It's really the only thing that will preserve them from regime change. This is the example of Libya, the bad example, positive example of North Korea. That's probably what's going to happen. Even Stevens, let's call it quits, guys. I mean, I don't. It's very hard for me to say this, but it looks like weapon systems might bring us to peace in a very weird way.
Let's zoom in here on, the Israeli regime. After restarting the genocidal war in Gaza in March, they had effectively cut all aid, entering the Gaza Strip, exacerbating the famine in Gaza. Then in May, they started this, aid charade is what I call it, distributing aid supposedly via the notorious Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, an American organization that, was headed by initially at least, an American military veteran. Palestinians in Gaza, would wake up daily in the middle of the night, walk in some cases hours to these aid distribution points to get food for their families, only to find themselves in the middle of literal killing fields, where many of are deprived of ever returning back to their families, who are starving. Even more atrociously, there have been reports of opioids being found in these bags of flour distributed to Palestinians. This is a new stage in the genocide, clearly, drugging and poisoning the population, but also, weaponizing drugs has, long been in the playbook of the West, as we know. Okay, as we've been talking about more recently, the Israeli regime conducts a surprise attack on Iran, assassinating top military leaders, targeting nuclear facilities, all while trying to collapse the Islamic Republic. After 12 days, the Israeli regime pushed for a pause in the hostilities because the losses it was taking both on its population as well as militarily were unsustainable. My question is, in your view, where are we at in the Israeli regime's long drawn out process of decline and collapse? What are these latest instances of drugging and the hostility against Iran indicating about the state of the regime? Where does it go from here?
I mean, you can look at this in terms of domestic policy. Benjamin Netanyahu faced a serious challenge in the parliament because the right wing parties were within days of walking out of his government. They wanted an exemption for military service. This is a big issue in Israel. And, Shas and others almost left. Well, you bombed Iran, that ended. There's a way to look at it from that perspective. Basically, there's also another way, which is that polling has shown that there's a very huge constituency for this barbaric genocide within Israel, and Israel might just continue to do this until somehow they attain some of their aims. One of the aims is total ethnic cleansing of Gaza. It's actually an aim that is not impossible. They almost did it before 1 million Palestinians marched northward in late January during the ceasefire. They did move a lot of Palestinians out of northern Gaza. I mean, it almost happened. So, they are making life just horrible for Palestinians in the West Bank. They can attain these ends, but at what cost? I mean, you get iron in the soul in the end. At what cost? At what cost are you doing this? I mean, it's a question you can ask the Indian government. At what cost are you intimidating Kashmiris? What do you gain of it? Kashmiris in particularly in the Srinagar Valley, from Pahalgam out to, let's say, the border regions in the north. I mean, what are you gaining from diminishing, people's dignity? What do you gain from it? Yeah. I'm not sure. I don't know what they would answer, but frankly, nobody has at least asked directly, Mr. Netanyahu, what will you gain from, taking the dignity away from millions of Palestinians? What do you gain from taking the dignity away from millions of people in other parts of the world? Kashmiris here, Palestinians there, somebody else over there, somebody else over there. What is being gained? I can't answer that because I don't agree with the policy.
Well, what about Iran then? So Iran, was relatively restrained in, its response to the hostility from Israel. This is sort of, and the U.S., I should say, this is sort of in accordance with how they sort of do things. Iran has also seen greater unity amongst its population since the hostilities began. Even among, dissenting factions of the population. Where does the Islamic Republic go from here as a sovereignty-seeking state project that is anti-Zionist and anti-imperialist? Where does it go? I mean, you mentioned the, testing nuclear weapons Yeah, take us from there.
I mean, let's deal with one thing right away. Um, it is Iran is an extremely proud country. The Iranian people are extremely proud of their history, and as one would be if you had a sort of unbroken history, long period of time. I mean, you want to seek parallels for that. Go talk to somebody in Tamil Nadu, where they can say, well, we can read the Sangam literature of the ancient world, and it makes complete sense. Not the same in other parts of the world. In North India, you hand, a farmer some text in Sanskrit and they're going to look at it and go, I can't even read this. Yeah. But you hand a farmer in Tamil Nadu a Sangam poem and he can read it or she can read it and maybe tell you what it says. I mean, there's an incredible sense of unbroken history. I mean, I'm doing this just to say that it's not that, oh, Iran has a ancient history and other people don't. Everybody has an ancient history, for God's sake. It's ridiculous, this idea that, but they have an unbroken, lineage with a language that is very old and powerful and whatever. They're a proud people. And so that pride is very hard to break. After the coup in 1953, when Mossadegh was removed and the new Shah was installed, the Shah had to manufacture this whole thing of ancient Iran. I mean, they were carpetbaggers. They were not some ancient Shahs, but he had to manufacture this old thing. And if you look at the insignias that they created, they all referred back to Cyrus and Darius the Great and so on. These are not descendants of Darius the Great. In this period, there is no alternative right now, no strong enough alternative political force to the Islamic Republic. I mean, it is ridiculous to assume that a son of a made-up Shah is going to fly in from Los Angeles and be welcomed in the way that Ayatollah Khomeini was welcomed in 1979, adoring crowds standing on the side of the road. I don't think it's going to happen. It's like Ahmad Chalabi in Iraq, he comes back to Iraq, people are like, who's he? Even though he comes from the Chalabi family of Iraq, very, important Shia family of Iraq, the elite Shia family. People were like, who's this guy? I have no idea who he is. Yeah. He was not welcomed with, sweets and roses as a professor in Boston said, an Iraqi professor said, we will be welcomed with sweets and flowers. You are not welcomed with sweets and flowers. Nobody knows you. Similar in Iran, there's no other game in town. The left is not strong enough. It has been largely liquidated anyway. The liberals are just not strong enough. The liberals try their hand at elections. They sometimes come to power. Their cause is not helped by the Americans. You see, when the liberals come in, Rafsanjani and others, they come in, they represent the wealthier sections of Iranian society within Iran. The United States says, oh, we like them. Well, that's the kiss of death. We like them. That means the Iranians are like, oh, well, when we don't like them anymore. It's a kiss of death. You don't want the Americans to support you like that. So there isn't another game in town. And I think the Iranians are pretty sharp, just as the junta in Burma is pretty sharp. I'm telling you, the day that the Israelis attacked Iran, the junta from Myanmar was on the phone with the North Koreans saying, brothers, send us the bomb. We need it, because history has shown that it is a rational choice. Why would you not have it? So, yeah, I think they're going to test a bomb. I think they had no intention to earlier. This war, which was supposed to be a war of non-proliferation, is actually a war of proliferation. It's going to get maybe Saudi Arabia, Turkey, these countries might all end up going nuclear. And that's all to be blamed on the Israelis.
Well, I guess to put it bluntly, are things going downhill from here in your view?
Not really. I mean, look, firstly, things are always in contradiction. Yeah. Downhill and uphill make no sense because things move in ways we don't anticipate. Yeah. I mean, is it downhill? I don't think so. Like people are like, oh my God, Trump is elected. That's terrible. On the other side of it, in Asia, There's growing consciousness about ecological things. China is the leading country to transition away from polluting to non-polluting. Yeah, the cities are again places where you can breathe air. Beijing's air quality has changed dramatically. They're cleaning up their lakes and rivers and so on. I mean, the whole world isn't the North Atlantic. So okay, Trump is elected. There's some lunatics in Europe and so on. That means nothing. At the same time, you have interesting developments in the Sahel, in Africa. You have real struggles taking place in South America, in Santiago, where I am the other day, in the left primary. Jeanette Hara, who's a communist, she's not a left wing person as such, like far left wing. She's a pretty moderate communist. I mean, it's a funny thing to say, yeah. She's a moderate communist, but that's what she is. She is going to enter the presidential election, to fight the right. I don't know if she'll be able to prevail. Probably not, but this is a hopeful side. Downhill, it's too negative. Yeah, I'm not of that mind. I always think things are always in flux. You never know what's going to happen. Things are in flux. And that's the important thing. We don't live in a period of stagnation. We live in a period of change.
That's good to reflect on. Okay, switching gears a little bit to zooming in on India, Pakistan, and Kashmir. One major outcome of this conflict between India and Pakistan has been the pausing of the Indus Water Treaty, which is essentially a water sharing treaty between the two countries. Since the Indus flows down into Pakistan from India, India is attempting here to assert leverage over the Pakistani economy by attempting to control its water supply. I want to ask you, what does this mean about, because this is really one of the major things that came out of this conflict. What does this mean about the kind of actor India is shaping up to be among the global South, where many other global South states, are seeking greater South-South cooperation? You can think of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, amongst themselves, between ASEAN and China. We mentioned the, Alliance of Sahel states. South Asia, in contrast, is probably one of the more economically fractured and siloed regions of the world. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is interesting. The way we have to think about these things. Let's stay with the issue in Kashmir. Yeah, it's been a very old and seemingly intractable problem. What is the problem in Kashmir? There are people who in 1947 were not given the permission to choose because it was a monarchy. And choosing meant either you go to India or you go to Pakistan. There was no third choice. Nobody asked if you could be independent. I mean, the Nawab of Hyderabad, for instance, yeah, wanted to be independent. I mean, there's no chance of that. What do you mean? Just because you are one of the richest men in the world, you can't be independent in the middle of India. It's not going to happen. The new Indian state was not going to permit it. But firstly, what gives you the right to speak for your people? It's very interesting. In Hyderabad, the Indian government ignored the wishes of the monarch and took the Hyderabad by storm. Yeah, it was the so-called police action. In Kashmir, the Indian government said, no, but the Maharaja of Kashmir has decided to join India. So that itself has got to be honored. There was no principles involved here. I just want to be clear because the Hyderabad Kashmir thing is relatively indicative of the lack of principled response. It was clear that Nehru felt that Kashmir had to be part of India. He was a Kashmiri, etc., whatever it might be. There was a casus belli in a way from both India and Pakistan, and both went to war. I mean, the first war between India and Pakistan is actually about Kashmir. There were other wars which weren't about Kashmir. 1971 was about, East Pakistan, eventually Bangladesh. Wasn't about Kashmir. You could even argue the 65 war, not about Kashmir. The 1999 Kargil war, not really about Kashmir. That was about issues involved in Pakistan itself, disputes amongst the various power factions in Pakistan, not really about Kashmir. In a sense, what I'm trying to say is after 1948, There really hasn't been a war about Kashmir. There's been a war where Kashmir has provided the excuse. And India and Pakistan have not allowed their disputes to be set to one side and the Kashmiri people's interest on the other. Okay. They've used, both India and Pakistan have used Kashmir to their own ends. It's a bit shameful to say so. The Kashmiri people have not had the right, to define their own reality. Yeah, and that's too bad because in a way we forget that the Kashmir Valley is small, but it's 15 million people roughly. It's not a small amount of people, on both sides of the border, and probably more if you add, the town of Bradford in the UK, which is effectively Greater Mirpur. The geography of Kashmir goes all the way into the heart of the UK. Okay, so that's a lot of people and their interests. Well, what are their interests? Um, because their interests have been used as a political football by India and Pakistan, you've seen an increase of independence activity. Yeah. People saying, well, Azad Kashmir, we want to be free and so on. I mean, and I can see that there's an attraction to this for people because they have been used as a football. And others sort of analogize Kashmir with Palestine or with, the Kurds and so on. Each of these analogies is worse than the other. There is no analogy. Why not just look at the Kashmir issue by itself? Once again, you're using the Kashmiris as a political football, saying let's analogize it to Palestine. Let's look at it for itself. What are the issues at stake here? There have been a million proposals, each of them, again, less practical than the others. Condominium, independent country. I mean, how are you going to manage an independent country? You go and talk to the Nepalis. How hard that has been. Landlocked country. Every time India wants to make trouble for you, they close the borders. You think if there's an independent Kashmir, the Indians and Pakistanis won't continue the same thing of using it as a political football, closing. Pakistan and Afghanistan don't have a settled border. They have a border dispute ongoing since 1940. Do you think it's going to be easy to settle a border with Kashmir? Will the Pakistanis allow so-called Pakistan occupied Kashmir or Azad Kashmir to be part of an independent Kashmir? I'm not sure. These are all unsettled questions. Idealism should not be the way forward. Some ideal solution. We need to look at what are the interests of the Kashmiri people, within Kashmir. We haven't heard from them in a long time. In India, the government has basically suspended the right of the Kashmiri people to have a political opinion by bringing it under first central government rule and so on. We need to spend some time trying to think about what is the practical solution for these issues, and let's separate this out from the India-Pakistan dispute, because the India-Pakistan dispute, let's face it, is a dispute between two ruling classes who enjoy the presence of this dispute because it allows them every once in a while to distract their populations from problems within inflation, price of onions and tomatoes skyrocketing. Let's start a conflict with the Pakistanis. Suddenly a tourist place is attacked in Pahalgam. I mean, how did this even happen? Have you seen the government report that explains how there was such a major security breach, intelligence breach, an attack on a tourist facility? Have you read the government report yet?
No, I haven't.
Because there is none. Because it was much easier to say, let's attack Pakistan than actually study an intelligence breach within India. Where is that? Democracy should have an immediate investigation, should provide. I mean, why are you investigating all these media houses and harassing them? Spend some time investigating how innocent civilians were killed. Investigate how a plane could crash on the way to London, killing everybody on the plane. Where are these investigations? In a democracy, that's what a government should be doing, not obsessing about what's happening in Pakistan.
Actually, I was coming to that. I was like, coming to about how, there was this whole reaction against Pakistan and, justice needs to be served. And yet, I mean, Kashmir is, occupied territory, one of the most, if not the most militarized regions in the world. And yet, one, this incident, this attack was able to take place, and two, 2 months out after, even after the India-Pakistan conflict, the ceasefire on May 12th, I believe it was, these people are still not caught supposedly by India, and then the same jingo is, right? Like, there's no follow-up, there's no reaction. Same thing about democracy. If you had any thoughts on that? But I also wanted to come back and expand a little bit on your thoughts on, is this sort of a change in how India is behaving geopolitically on the world stage compared to other global South countries in a moment of at least cautious optimism about South-South cooperation?
Firstly, India is a massive country, with an enormous bureaucracy, even though it's a shrunk bureaucracy, enormous. And lots of different things are happening at the same time. I think it's important to recognize that on the one side, you've got, people saying, let's go and bomb terrorist sites in Pakistan. On the other side, you have people building trade relations with, the Gulf states. So even with Pakistan, these things are happening simultaneously. I mean, India has recognized one thing, which is that the market of last resort is no longer going to be the Western countries, that South-South trade is more important. What India is actually not doing, and what you see, for instance, China doing, or you see Brazil doing, and so on, is expanding its regional advantages. Brazil has put on the table South American integration. It's a very poorly integrated country. It is very highly integrated to China, to Europe, to the United States, not to Argentina, not to Chile, not to Bolivia, and so on. Not a very highly integrated. So they are trying to do that, build their integration into their neighborhood. The Chinese, for instance, through ASEAN, but then RCEP, the largest trading bloc in world history. China is basically knit all the countries in its neighborhood except India into its trading world. I mean, China is the largest trading partner of every single country in its immediate neighborhood, including what appear to be adversaries like South Korea and Japan and so on. Australia, the biggest trading partner of Australia, major figure in AUKUS and in the Squad and this, that, a major trading partner of Australia is China. So, the Chinese have done this, the Brazilians have done this. South Africa is a little more complicated. They've been trying this for decades, to become a major player in economic player in the neighborhood and so on. Not India. I mean, partly because India is trapped by these quite ridiculous conflicts between Pakistan. That, of course, impacts what India is able to do or not do with Bangladesh, because relations with Pakistan continue to impact Bangladeshi politics. There are pro-India groups and anti-India groups and so on. This is there in Nepal as well. Nepali politics is shaped by pro-India groups, anti-India groups. It's ridiculous. There should be pro-South Asian politics. SAARC is basic. SAARC is the South Asian regional cooperation. It's basically a defunct, name, doesn't exist as such. It should be vibrant in this time of building regional commodity chains, and at this time of BRICS and so on. India should be a regional pole, building the vitality of the Sri Lankan economy, being a part of the development of an industrial chain within Pakistan and so on. But India is nowhere. Why? Still got border disputes with Pakistan, still have the old Kalapani border dispute with Nepal, still have border disputes with China. Settle all these. What's holding us back? Our economic development is being forestalled because we are unable to finish these political disputes. And that's crazy. Kala Pani, for God's sake. India and Nepal. I mean, why are you bullying poor old Nepal?
It is crazy. It's absolutely, I mean, there's no better word. Last thing on this, the in terms of the India-Pakistan conflict militarily, right? I mean, there's somewhat consensus on this that the Indians were sort of embarrassed by the Pakistan's use of Chinese military technology. And this was at a time where the India-China relationship was starting to at least cautiously soften up. You had seen sort of also the Quad, if I'm not wrong, be sort of on pause or not as much activity. I just saw yesterday that the Quad had met again, and they condemned the Pahalgam attack and talking about critical minerals at the time, or rare earths or critical either of them. At a time when China's been restricting its exports to the rest of the world. So now it seems like the China-India relationship is sort of on hold again. Your thoughts on that? Uh, both the China-India relationship, but also like how is China's approach to the international situation changing after the India-Pakistan conflict as well as the Iran-Israel conflict?
Yeah, it's interesting because one has to watch all these things very carefully, and have a factual understanding of what's going on. I mean, it should be said that India-China relations fluctuates very, very fast. And, while all this was happening, or just before it was happening, India-China decided to increase the visas they give to each other's citizens. A very good sign. Um, who knows? Yeah. I mean, I am confident that there are some rational people in the Indian foreign ministry, different levels of officers in who are in communication with their counterparts in China and effectively are cautioning people against overreaction to developments taking place, say, between India and Pakistan and so on. They are being they are saying, look, let's improve people to people contact, more visas for students and so on. And let's, open up some lines of business and, restrictions being reduced and so on. I mean, the general approach in the last 2 years that I've seen between India and China is in this direction. Don't open the big issues of Arunachal Pradesh. Don't discuss that. You may remember that some years ago, two archers from Arunachal Pradesh were going to go and participate in a tournament in China, and they were stopped from leaving India because the Chinese didn't stamp their passport; they just stapled the visa. The reason being that it's a disputed area. China says that part of Arunachal is part of China, so they won't stamp the Indian passport. The Indian said you can't go unless there's a stamp in your passport. I mean, I understand that Arunachal is a very, very tense area in terms of India and China. And that will take some time to settle. But you see, the issue in diplomacy is never the grand bargain. The grand bargain only happens when there's enormous political, understanding and political will. Then you can go to the table and say, let's put all the 20 issues on the table. Let's put these into a folder. Let's shake hands right now. Grand bargain. Yeah. All our issues will be solved. Those will be solved in time. But you know what? We're committing to it. In 2 months, let's close the files. Okay. That's a grand bargain. Yeah. Where there's huge political will. India and China don't have that. India and Pakistan don't have that. You got to start small. You got to say, okay, let's take Aksai Chin. Are we basically in agreement that, the Chinese road is acceptable to India, that you have a road from Xinjiang to Tibet? It's acceptable. We don't have any civilians there. At the same time, tell the Chinese Tawang Monastery. I mean, for God's sake, that's, been part of India since 1947. Give it up, guys. Okay, let's sign off on these two. Start there, builds confidence, then go to the next order of business. Let's double student visas. Eventually we'll come to Arunachal. Why put the toughest file at the front? Same with India and Pakistan. The toughest file is defining everything, terrorists, etc. I mean, the Pakistanis turn around and say, well, you're supporting these fellows in Balochistan. What about that? Don't start there. Start with the simplest matters. 90% of the India-Pakistan border is a border. We understand it. We don't like it. Nobody likes it. Yeah. I think partition was a horrible thing. My family had to leave Lahore and go, into, I mean, whatever, but that doesn't, it's over now. It's done. 90% of the border can be delimited today. It's a 10%, 15% up there in Kashmir, somewhere up near Gulmarg, beautiful places. Yeah. There's a undefined region. Let's come to some understanding. Okay, we you understand that the people in the Srinagar Valley, are unhappy. You claim them as part of Pakistan, whatever. Let's just make an understanding. That part of Mirpur and so on, that's going to be now understood to be temporarily in Pakistan. Srinagar and this is temporary, and is temporarily in India. Let's start with that basis. So in my opinion, we as sensitive, sensible people need to argue. Let's settle all the easy disputes. India and Nepal. One of the things India and Nepal need to settle on is India has to agree not to shut the border to punish Nepal. That should be treated as, tantamount to a crime. What's the difference between like starving a population and closing the India Nepal border? It closes the border to everything. People on the border regions, fuel doesn't go in. It should be a relatively open border between Nepal and India, frankly. Relatively. In fact, now the BJP should support that because they are trying their best to influence politics in the Madhesh region, growing the BJP and so on. I don't agree with any of that. But for people's everyday transactions, businesses and so on, suffocating the border is a bad idea. Start small, build later.
Okay, I want to switch gears a little bit again. Let's talk about the recent Democratic primary win by Zoran Mamdani. I want to get your thoughts on how you see this. I mean, there's been many a debate on the left, the global left, the left in the US. There's outstanding issues of his affirming Israel's right to exist, calling October 7th a war crime, a little bit weak on the NYPD, I mean, which is larger than a lot of countries' militaries. And ultimately he's running as a Democrat, subject to co-optation. Similar story as we saw with AOC, especially, and Bernie Sanders. These are some of the arguments. On the other side, I mean, I also see this, right, that this is quite an upset in New York City, the capital of global capital, if you will, where the billionaires feel at home. The defeat of the Cuomo dynasty, that's definitely not something trivial. It's clearly still a shock to the Democratic establishment, many of whom, have, like Obama, for example. I looked up what Obama has had to say about Mamdani. As far as I can see, it's silence. Some others, sort of endorsing him, seeing if they can pull him in. Um, these people have lost their way essentially after Kamala's loss, last year. And then on the other hand, on Mamdani's side himself, I mean, he seems like he has a little bit more conviction. I've been following him for a while. I mean, he's been in, doing, organizing work. He's, been part of the left, the social democratic left, I guess, for a while. Working class struggles. He's worked, to get debt relief for taxi drivers, things like that. If you take a more historical view, right, of socialism, capitalism, but maybe this opens up some space, for the left. I mean, I know you've talked about that. It's important that space for the left, at least initially, gets opened up. So, I mean, those are, the two sides of it, I guess, that I've been thinking about, and many have been thinking about. How do you see this? Does this open up political horizons for socialism in the imperial core? But what are those horizons if they sort of disavow anti-imperialism? I mean, coming back to his position on, Palestinian self-determination, Israel, etc.
I mean, I just love the way you frame this because you're so filled with hesitations, and if you don't want to come out and say anything because you're scared of that you'll now be called some. You know what I mean? The world has become crazy. Okay, firstly, I don't think you live in New York. I don't live in New York. This is a election for New Yorkers, okay, and they make a decision. So, but on the other hand, you're right. New York is not just a city for New Yorkers. It has an enormous global footprint. So you're very correct in that observation. Secondly, this is amazing for me because, of course, I know his father, Mahmoud Mamdani, the great Ugandan scholar of Africa. I know his work, I know him. I know his mother even better, Meera Nair, the filmmaker, made, one of my favorite films, which is Monsoon Wedding, one of my favorite films, which redeems, in a way, the possibility of Punjabi manhood. Yeah, when the father says to the uncle, "Get out of here." Yeah, that just made me want to jump up and scream with joy. Punjabi men, not so bad after all, and so on. Yeah, love his mother's films. She's a terrific filmmaker, Meera Nair. So he comes from there. He's only in his early 30s, young guy. Yeah, grew up in a way between Africa and India and New York. Classic New Yorker in that sense. He's a very progressive guy. I mean, there's a lot in him that's extraordinary. I think the problem with people on the left in many places is you can't understand how to build majorities. You can't understand how to build movements. They are more moralistic in their politics. If they don't agree with you a little bit, somebody says of me, he should be cancelled because his position on Kashmir is bad. Why? Because I won't say free Kashmir, which is a meaningless slogan. Doesn't make sense to me. Yeah. In the same way as say free Palestine makes sense to me. It has a different resonance. The Kashmiri movement is fractured and torn up, and it's in a different reality. Yeah. Doesn't make sense. Well, he's not saying it, so cancel him. Yeah. He's against the Uyghurs. I don't know where people get these things from, but there's an enormous morality based politics, which is morality in the wrong sense, not in the expansive sense of increasing humanity, but in, litmus testing. What's your position on this? Are you for this or against it? Are you for trans or against trans? Are you for Uyghurs or against Uyghurs? Politics doesn't work like that, more complicated. Zoran Mamdani is a very progressive young man. He's trying to expand the horizon of New York politics, a place where Eric Adams, the mayor, sent basically riot police against pro Palestinian demonstrators. I doubt very much Zoran Mamdani is going to sign off on something like that. Um, Mayor after mayor in New York has increased, the repression has decreased the social welfare opportunities, rent control, and so on. The last democratic socialist you had in New York was David Dinkins, a black mayor of the city, a very popular guy. He was a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. Zoran Mamdani is a member of the, I mean, he won't be the first socialist mayor of New York. As I said, David Dinkins was there already. But he will be a socialist mayor of New York at a time when the United States has gone so far to the right. I mean, is this the time to nitpick and say I don't agree with him on this? Okay, fine. Stay home and be pure. Stay home and be pure. Do nothing and be pure. Okay. Those of us interested in building political movements and so on, we can't have your luxury of purity. We are stuck trying to build majorities. I commend Zoran for threading the needle the way he is. He's doing a very careful job trying to build a majority. Well played to him. To consider Zoran in the same way as AOC, I think is a really malicious thing, because you don't know how Zoran would have voted had he been in Congress on X bill regarding the Palestinians or funding for the military. Would he have gone along with the Democratic whip? I don't know. I actually don't think so. I think he would have stood up and said, I don't agree with this. He's a very, very, he comes with a very strong center, but he's threading the needle, man. This is politics. Politics is not, as I said, it's not a morality play.
We're sort of getting at something here. I wanted to ask you about um, socialism, the left, and the road to socialism. Okay, so socialist movements of the 20th century, that was really, in a lot of ways, depending on who you ask, the zenith of socialist struggles. Okay, like, they struggled to change the relations of production, more egalitarian relations, focus on those manifested in socialist states. across the world, across the global south. But of course, we know this history, the collapse of the USSR and reform in other parts of the socialist world sort of resulted in a downturn, in the popularity of socialist ideas globally. On the other hand, the capitalist system is not eternal. It is a world historical one. I mean, emerged at a particular time under particular circumstances and conditions. It is not going to stay this way forever. I mean, that's dialectics, that's Marxism. But and that system will change and transform. It needs to, but that transformation process is slow and spans, multiple lifetimes. I think it's funny. I remember once you said socialists are, exiles from the future. I found that very hilarious. But we're getting at this. This is a weakness of the left, in the imperial core in particular, I guess, per my observation, to not be able to take sort of a long historical view of transformation, right? Multi-lifetime. So the question here is, taking this historical long transition view of the global shift from capitalism to socialism, we have to make that happen. What do you see as the tasks of the global left today, after facing major setbacks over the past 30 to 50 years? Socialism as a term, at least in the imperial core, is not as, popular. And, even Zoran Mamdani calling himself a democratic socialist, emphasizing the democratic there quite a bit. So, in other words, for socialists or communists today, where is the socialist horizon? How do we orient around it? And how does that inform, what is to be done today?
I mean, the thing is that the world is really in a difficult situation. Yeah. We have a kind of culture of cruelty which has become completely normal. Hunger is something that is acceptable to so many people. So many people believe that it's okay to spend more on weapons than to eradicate poverty. And that's a culture of cruelty. That's the normal culture. We are at an enormous disadvantage as the left. We're going against the whole tide of culture. Rational intellectualism has taken a beating. The academy is filled with people who are specialists, unwilling to come out there and speak for the generality of humanity and so on. That has really harmed our culture, our societies. The fact that this enormous intellectual class in the North Atlantic region has basically taken a job and has disarmed itself immediately. Said, "Well, I'm a specialist. I deal with 18th century X." And these are brilliant people who understand, how the world should work and so on. We need them to be more vocal and to stand up for the values of humanism, which ground their entire profession. I mean, at least in its historical form. They have just absented themselves. Millions of intellectuals absented themselves from the debate and allowed right-wing zealots to basically command the space and say, no, wait a minute, we need weapons because there's dangerous people at the gates. The lack of the debate is really disarming for the left, for socialism. You can't build socialism unless you're able to make the debate, and come there and say, hey, wait a minute, we don't agree with this. Who's dangerous? If crime rates really risen? I don't think so. They haven't. What's the threat? What is your threat assessment? If you bomb Iran, the Iranians will come back and attack you. But if you don't bomb them, if you negotiate with them, they are reasonable people. Yeah. As the debate goes in South Asia, is Pakistan a Westphalian state or a failed state? I mean, this is a ludicrous debate. Yeah. Most human beings would like to have a rational debate and say, look, I'm not interested in the conflict. If you're on the street and somebody just excessively with a belligerent personality wants to, rumble with you, other people will intervene and say, hey, take it easy, guy. That's how the world works. There's a lot of people who want to say, take it easy. It's called the United Nations. Yeah, we've got to strengthen the United Nations. All of this is moving towards building near a socialist agenda. Right now, the socialist agenda is really a social democratic agenda until we push the gates further and see the class struggle intensifying. Right now, most of the things socialists are talking about, eradicating poverty, peace, development. These are basically things that if there were social democrats in the world, they would be fighting for. They don't exist. Yeah, they've become neoliberals. So we are forced to do their historical mission. We are not, there's no space for us to say, let's intensify the class struggle. Yeah. Then you'll be sectarian out here saying, I'm not interested in solving the poverty question. I'm intensifying the class struggle. Okay, you may be right. That's what Marxists are supposed to do. But right now, our historical mission is basically being shifted because the social democrats and liberals have vanished. You see a person hungry on the street, you can't just say, "Hey, listen, there's a liberal behind me. He's going to feed you." I'm building the class struggle. I can't solve your. You can't do that. You're a human being. You got to say, how do we feed these people? How do we fight for soup kitchens and so on? That's the problem with socialist politics today. So when you say, "Oh, Zoran Mamdani, he's a limited social democrat," but so are you. What's your agenda that's so radical? How are you able to intensify the class struggle by yourself? The tempo right now is not moving in that direction. So don't lecture Zoran Mamdani or myself and say, you guys are just like liberals. Well, yes, because they have absented themselves. So we have to fight against hunger and we have to fight against illiteracy and so on. Yeah, we have to fight in this terrain until sufficient numbers of liberals are back on the field, social democrats. Then we can go and say, I'm against the politics of social democracy. I want something more radical than that. Unless the people are on the streets, strikes and so on, you can't just stand there and say, hey, go on strike. Right now the class struggle is defined by the bourgeoisie. The owners of property are the ones who are driving the class struggle. The workers are not. That's the stage of history we're in. So I can't stand on the sidewalk like some mad person saying I've been communicating with aliens. Workers go on strike. The workers will look at me and go, man, I'm a Uber Eats guy. I got to go deliver the food. Can you just make room for my bicycle?
That's a good place to leave it, Vijay. Thanks so much for coming back on the podcast. Really appreciate your time.
Take care of yourself, okay?